And sorry, thank you, Tony. Please go ahead.
Big brother is watching. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. This is the Indigenous Day of Prayer. We commemorate this on this day because this was the origin of the Indigenous Peoples Day. I'll talk a bit about that later. This is an important day for our communities across this country. In many communities, this is the high time of our ceremonies. And so on the Stony Reserve in June is when we have our sun dances. And that's the apex of the season, and what we call, the name of the month is called When Everything Turns Green. And at that time, it's a bounty and awakening of the world. And so we greet that world with prayer, we greet that world with celebration, we greet that world with feasting and fellowship. But we also remember that there are challenges to that. And we reflect upon the winter that we've endured and the hard times and the things to come, but we take this time to take a breath. We offer our Chinook Winds land acknowledgement here. We recognize that the Chinook Winds region of the United Church of Canada is constructed upon the territories covered by Treaties 4, 6, and 7. We realize that there is a deep, complex history between the United Church of Canada and the 59 Indigenous nations, regions, and regions of the Métis Nation that call these territories their home. The Chinook Winds region, through the TRC calls to action and the principles of UNDRIP, has dedicated itself to learning, engaging, and following through on its commitments to build better relationships with Indigenous people through reconciliation and repair. We acknowledge that shared stewardship is needed in all our communities of faith. We acknowledge that in order to achieve balance, we must contend with some harsh truths and change our ways in order to participate fully at God's table. Help us find a way to reconcile for past abuses, hurts, and genocidal actions. Help us to speak truth and honesty to our Indigenous neighbours, so our children and the children yet to come can live in a world without racial discrimination, abuse, and pain. Today, as we reflect upon Indigenous People Day, we talk about the origin. And so we talk about the Ecumenical Conference at Morley that happened from 1971 to 1985, and the importance of this event for our community and what it means to the church, what it means to Indigenous people, and our ability to work together on some of these issues that we have been confronting for a long time. For the Stoney people, the Indigenous Day activities that we observe are more in line with remembrance and somber reflection on our relationship and what could have been from the signing of the treaties. And so when the elders of the Ecumenical Conference came together in 1971 at the second annual Ecumenical Conference in Morley, the first one was held in Montana. And then they came up to Morley and they stayed for 15 years. They kept coming back. And so it's been, for that group, a reflection on where they had been, where they had come from, the journey through colonization, through assimilation, and through some of the trials. And the first thing that they did was to call for a day of prayer, a National Indian Day of Prayer, they called it. And that was to help respond to some of the issues that we had been facing and some of the history that had been ongoing, and the importance of remembering who we are at this time and how we step into the world. The event was curated and advocated by a Cherokee anthropologist named Bob Thomas. And in his writings and his speeches, he said, "We are hoping to mediate some of the religious factionalism in the Indian communities to return some social power to Indian religious leaders and to strengthen social controls and generally revive the spiritual strength of North American Indians. So until this point, they had been fractured from their traditions, and they had to find a way to reconnect and to bring back the spirit, bring back the soul of the people. And through prayer is our traditional way of dealing with that sense of loss and that sense of displacement. And so the wandering spirit was being called back to the bodies of the young people and the bodies of our places of worship, our sacred spaces, and to try to restore some of the balance of creation in this work. So very much like the Sundance time, it's a prayer for creation, a time of prayer for everything around us, and to reset in balance some of the things that we had to put up with. And a lot of that was the fractures, the fissures that happened because of Christian influence and going against our indigenous teaching and calling our traditional teaching demonic and other things that warded people away from our traditional way of life. And so to demystify that and to bring us to a new sense of reality, the Ecumenical Conference was installed to bring a lot of clergy together and a lot of people to talk about some of the efforts that were going on in our communities to decolonize Christianity, to decolonize some of our traditional thinking, and to bring us to a new understanding of how we can live in balance in a new world with different rules and parameters and different laws. And so for this work, we set up the Indian Ecumenical Conference. And this is my father's quote. Our teaching has always been that everything was created for a purpose by the Great Spirit. We must therefore respect all things of creation and learn as much as we can. There are lessons hidden in creation that we must learn in order to live a good life and walk the straight path. Behind these lessons and teachings is the Creator. These things can only be understood through the Great Spirit. And so in this arbor that we created every year, this was the spot that we had the sacred fire that was lit by a medicine man from the Navajo tribe in Arizona. And they would come up every year and do the specific, they don't light it with matches, they light it with flints. And so this was a sacred fire that we were not to put anything that was garbage or anything that was not purely for medicinal purposes or sacred plants and stuff like that, that we would give offering to in prayer for our journey here on earth. So it's at some points, this ceremony, this journey for the Ecumenical Conference took 7 days. And other times we would go for 4 days in the later part of the holding of these. The last one was in 1992 for the Columbus 500-year memorial on that occasion. And so the thinking around this, there was a book called Around the Sacred Fire by James Treat, and he talks about some of the symbolism and some of the meaning behind and some of the characters who were involved with the Ecumenical Conference. And so he says, blessing way, which is a Navajo tradition, the pipe, which is our Stony and Sioux tradition, and the sacred fire that came from the East, symbolize the tribal diversity represented at the conference and illustrate the ecumenical possibilities of such a gathering. They also demonstrated the vitality of native spiritual practices. These were living traditions drawn from 3 distinct religious communities, each rooted in unbroken history of adaptation and survival on the North American continent. We're all different tribes and different faiths. Still, we've got a lot in common, Bob Thomas said, who told the assembled delegates on Monday afternoon. We know that we're all native of this island here. We know that God made us out of this soil here. We know there's a creator above, and there's certain rules he gave us and certain relationships we're supposed to have with this land. the conference was now more than a meeting of religious people. It had become a meeting of religions. This is the board of that ecumenical conference, the steering committee. The steering committee called for a day of prayer in 1971. And these are all the traditional leaders. A lot of them were traditional practitioners of their communities, First Nation and Indigenous practices. And so a lot of them were holders of different types of rights, and they came together to teach that to the young people, because when the young people were starting to arrive, a lot of them came for verification of the practice, because they had been doing what they thought they were supposed to do, but because of the colonization, a lot of those histories were not passed down to them. And so they came to the conference to try to relearn what the basics of their practice would be, and why they were doing what they were doing, and some of the ways that they could adapt that into their own particular ways for their Indigenous nations. Because some of us have a particular route of what we do, and then it branches out and changes, much like a United Church service would be centered around a type of thinking, but then there would be all types of variation involved with it. And so here, the quote from James Treat: "At one point, Bob Thomas took to the floor to discuss the idea of declaring an Indian Day of Prayer. The steering committee was recommending that June 21st be set aside as a holy day, as a day of prayer and fasting to all Indians everywhere, a day when we could think about our place in the universe and what we're supposed to do to carry on what our old people told us. Tribal communities, partnership with this land, and the whole spiritual world, that's a part of it. We know that's out of kilter now," Thomas said. "The transnational commemoration might help get things back in balance again, the way it used to be." At this time, because of the nature of that factionalism, it's important to have support from the church and from the different denominations. So we had denominations from Catholic and Anglican, United Churches, others more mainline churches, and a few of the evangelical churches as well. And as that continued over time, we had different groups that came out. And so some of the practices were honored by these groups. So the Anglican United Churches played a critical role in another important legacy of the ecumenical movement. In 1971, after the steering committee declared the June 21st as a National Day of Prayer, both denominations passed resolutions endorsing this action and encouraging their parishes and congregations to participate. Conference leaders promoted the observance as long as Bob Thomas was involved with the movement, and many Christian bodies continued to support the annual commemoration throughout the 70s. And so we had a day of prayer observed in the United Church and the Anglican Church in the 1970s. One of the things that the connectors of this is that in Stoney culture, we were brought the Bible, we were brought the Christian teaching by the Anishinaabe missionary Henry Bird Steinhauer from the east, from Rama, Ontario, and Ojibwe Anishinaabe missionary that came out, was trained, as I said before, in Boston and then in England, had numerous languages under his belt, and came to bring our teaching, but brought it in a way that was compatible and understandable to an Indigenous ear. And so one of the things that became important was this ability to hold a dual faith and understand how Christianity fit into the ways of Indigenous spirituality. So here it says, "And the need for an Indian ecumenical movement is utmost in the minds of many Indian leaders, advocating a new direction in Indian affairs. Their proposal closed with this imperative: Native Indian religionists of all Christian and Aboriginal sects must assemble and start the painful process of conceptually sewing together their fragmented sacred world, so Indians can once again take steps to act for their own future welfare." And so in this idea of reclaiming that identity, it's an ability to not only move in a different direction and put aside their Christian teaching, but to adapt and to work toward a balance between those ideas, so that in the end, moving forward, we would have people who would be in an understandable position to their Christian faith and also to their Indigenous practice and what that looked like for the future. And Bob Thomas at the bottom here, I just reiterated that quote about religious factionalism. So it was to address some of that, and it was to find a better balance for the future. So we, in 2020, we had a revival of the practices. 2019, we went out to the sacred areas to perform ceremonies and bring clergy, Indigenous clergy and others from the United Church to share some of these teachings and revitalize some of the efforts of the ecumenical movement. And so many elders and people from the Stony Reserve have been instrumental in taking part in this and in reclaiming some of the names and some of the homeland of the Indigenous people with the MOU that was signed with the Banff Parks in 2010 and other times that we have asserted our right in these areas. So here's a bit of the history of Indigenous Day. This is the political history that took place after the Declaration and after the 1970s. So 1982, the newly formed Assembly of First Nations, led by David Ahenekue, the nephew of Andrew Ahenekue, launched a campaign to get June 21st designated as the National Aboriginal Solidarity Day in Canada. The first official response came in 1990 with the Quebec legislature, acknowledged June 21 as a day to celebrate Native cultural traditions. Delegates to the 1995 Sacred Assembly, hosted by Elijah Harper, renewed the call for a national commemoration. In 1996, the Canadian government responded by proclaiming June 21 as National Aboriginal Day. So it was 1996 that they finally acknowledged that day. And this was on the cusp of a number of movements within the culture. So you have Oka that came up in shortly before that. You have issues that are arising from the Aboriginal governance inquiry that went across the country. And so there was RCAP and other events that triggered the awareness around Indigenous issues and the place of this National Aboriginal Day. And so after the United Church apology in 1998, you have this idea of there's a response coming from Canada. There's a following, there's a leadership being led by the United Church. And that in this observance, we were taking the teaching from the Morley ecumenical elders. And here, James Treat notes, with the exception here, a few Canadians realized that this holiday began as a holy day conceived at the Indian Ecumenical Conference in Morley. Fewer still that the idea first suggested by Browning Pipestem, an Odo, Missouri lawyer from the US, in that meeting. And so that's where our National Aboriginal Day comes from. National Indigenous Day, it was changed to in 2009. No, it became Indigenous Day in 2017. So it's only more recently that we've had these changes. So in our observance of this, a lot of things have happened. Here we see some of the social activism that's happening in Morley, the orange shirts and commemorative vigils that are being held for the 215 children, and the reminder that the Morley residential school was also one, and the Red Deer residential industrial school was part of that system of indoctrinating Indigenous people. And there's a lot of hard feelings and a lot of regret around that, and a need to reform our relationships. Here we see in 2018 the continued effort of the Ecumenical Conference that we take to the Banff Indian Days and practice sort of the same activities that we did at the Ecumenical Conference. They've been revived here at the Banff Indian Days for the last decade to try to build relationship and restore some of the feelings to give people access back to the national park. The Indigenous people, the Stoney people, were banned from the park for 100 years. And then when the centennial came around, there was a need to reform that relationship and to try to clean it up. And so in doing that, they revived the Banff Indian Days, which had been called Buffalo Days. And here it's an observance more of the culture, because this is the Banff area, Minurpa, as it's called in our language, is a sacred valley with a lot of medicinal herbs, with the hot springs, with Minithni, which is a sacred lake, with the waterfall cascade. That there's a lot of markers in this area of the people's place of worship. This is a very special area that they would go to only for sun dances and only for vision quests and special times. And so a very powerful area. And now it's a tourist hub, and we're trying to find a balance between the way that we can perform our ritual and custom and worship in these areas. But for the Banff Indian Days, they have a powwow and other events that come on where they welcome people from the community and outside the community to come and take part, as they would have during the Banff Indian Days, which started around the end of the 1800s. Here at the Indian Ecumenical Conference, we had facilities that were built there. We were going to rebuild this in 2019 to house the cookhouse and all the foods that would be delivered to the people. So at times we had a couple thousand people that would attend, and so we needed a place to centralize cooking and deliver food and meals to people that were staying there. And that part of the churches helped a lot with that, and other groups helped a lot with that. A quick overview of some of the facts of the residential school system that had been so prevalent in the work that we're doing. So there were 25 of 139 recognized Alberta residential schools in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So there were 29 out of 35 residential schools across the country, and Alberta had 25 of those. And those were not the only residential schools in the province. There were a lot of others that were privately held or held by smaller denominations. And so there were more residential school impacts that we don't know about. And so the parameters of the Indian Residential School Settlement that was reached in 2008 only recognized 25 of those. There were across the country the recorded deaths of the students, of the children. 4,117 occurred at residential schools. 800 were recorded in Alberta, and private and other schools were not part of the lawsuit. In 1935, that's when the federal government began to require documentation of deaths. So there were a lot of deaths before that, and that happened that people didn't know about and had only been in rumor or oral narrative that was passed on. And so a lot of that is unrecorded. In instances, 23% of the genders of the students were not identified. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation says 49% of cases, the cause of death isn't documented. In this notion of how do we deal with these issues, one of the things that continues to come up, or questions, is around the idea of reconciliation. And so from the point of view of Indigenous reconciliation processes, this meeting of the Indigenous worldview and the European Eurocentric worldview that we have from Canada is a way of trying to share information. So at the top, you see the sharing between them. On the one hand, you have the Indigenous people who are doing truth telling, and the Eurocentric group having to change their behavior and the way that they treat or act toward Indigenous people. And so this becomes complication on which parties are being involved and how they are acting toward one another, and whether there's any type of reparation that exists. as we look at the bottom here, the third part of this is the religious and institutional practices, the agencies of Department of Indian Affairs, Department of Indigenous Affairs now, how they respond to, as an agent of that Eurocentric worldview, how do they respond in their practices? How do they change what they're doing? And so trying to find a way to enact laws or ways that the practice can change and shift so that we're not having to deal with this in the same way all the time, or that it's something that is glossed over in our rhetoric. The reason I bring this up is because, to give an example of Kamloops, the Secwepemc did the truth telling, and the Canadians responded. And we haven't yet seen a change of behavior, but we've seen an acknowledgement of that truth telling. And so how does that then change in terms of our sharing and how we apply our laws and code systems in order to adapt what we know to make that truth telling addressed in some way to offer reparation? So the Indigenous Affairs and Judiciary in practice have been blocking a lot of the claims that are going forward, have been not cooperative and not really addressing some of the issues, water issues and other things that are happening in those communities that most Canadians are bored with and don't want to see in a country that has such a bounty, people being treated differently. And so trying to apply that change in behavior to those institutional spaces and call for greater accountability. There's a need there, and there's a way that we need to address that holistically. And in part, what we're saying through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is that this portion down here that says teaching is a way of working through and changing institutional practice to be amenable to some of the hardships that are coming up from the Indigenous people. So the people who are putting claims in that have been confronted by lawyers for the Crown that don't want to do any of the work of justice for these groups becomes intolerable for a lot of the people that want to see a better outcome or a redress of some of these issues because of the nature of that finding in Kamloops. And so here, how do we work toward a repair of those relationships? And so in this example, trying to find a balance between what is being told, what's being newly addressed in this system, being taken on by the partner in the system, the Canadians, and then through that mechanism of institution, how do we change that institution to make it responsive and make it work for the interests of both parties rather than being punitive towards the Indigenous people. In our tradition, this word, this phrase here is our doctrine around reconciliation. Minjakiabi chaunt oyada gichiam iabi chach means it's in part saying that there's truth telling, and that in the truth telling of the truth and reconciliation part, the response is important, the supporting of that response and the acknowledgement of that response in order to take on board what is being told and how a workable solution can come out of that. And so there's a listening portion, and then there's acknowledgement and a repair and action afterwards that leads us into a righting of the relationships. And so that's a bit of the way in which we engage with some of this material. So here I've shown to people before the Indigenous History Month and the advocacy. We have the Indian Ecumenical Day of Prayer, the Aboriginal Day, Aboriginal Month, which is changed to Indigenous Peoples Day in 2017. and all the efforts in the government of Canada and in the United Church of Canada and in responses. It's all been through advocacy of the Indigenous people. So the Indigenous Ecumenical Conference Day of Prayer came from the elders of that committee. The apology came from Alberta Billy, who was a member of the Weebekay Nation in BC on Vancouver Island. And in 1991, she stood up to the United Church Executive and said they needed to apologize for what they did to people in residential school. And then in 1996, the response from Edith Memnook when they received the first apology, that in 1998, an acknowledgement of that apology that it happened, and then a supporting document that said, we pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that these are the words of action and sincerity. So the apology was never taken on board, but it was saying we will judge by the actions of the church whether or not this apology is actually in practice. So it's going back to that supporting and listening, and then what the reparation is, what it looks like if things are changing. And so a lot of the work that we do today is very indicative of that. Going through the residential school agreement, going through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the findings of that report. A lot of that we can see from the actions that the residential school agreement was met, the apology was made, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission addressed a lot of the issues that were coming up, but then the implementation has not happened over the past 6 years since it was put forward in 2015. And so during the time, I think it was 2010, they wanted the death registry of all the students to be filled out by the churches and by the places where those bodies were buried. That never happened. And there was restriction on funding that didn't allow that to happen. And so there was a lot of mitigating circumstances that got in the way of that, the way that things turned out. And so when we see the bodies that were unearthed by the ground penetrating radar, everybody is aghast, but these have not been addressed, and they have been systemically sidelined by our leaders, by our governments, by those that are tasked with fulfilling the responsibility. In the United Church, we've done a lot of work in trying to bring together our understanding. And I'll end off with this, but this is the timeline. So in the 1960s, there was Vatican II, there was an openness towards Indigenous people, there was an openness towards Indigenous relations. In the document for Vatican II, one of the things that Pope Francis pointed out in his last encyclical, Beloved Amazonia, was to talk about that in the 1960s, during that Vatican II document, there was a call for a greater leniency around Indigenous practice and Indigenous ways of thinking, Indigenous ways of worship, to incorporate those into the communion, incorporate those into the way that people were practicing, which had not been implemented. And so for 50 years, we've been dealing with a lack of movement on that type of issue, which would have opened up, I think, a great deal of conversation and a great deal of understanding if we had lived into those commitments. Because a lot of the changes that came out of there influenced a lot of the other churches, a lot of the United Church activity and the Anglican Church activity. The Anglicans in the 1970s began working with Bob Thomas on the ecumenical movement, and that came out of as a response to some of the issues that were arisen from Vatican II and the openness that they wanted for demystifying church practice and becoming more relational to the people. Also in the 1970s and 80s, you had lesbian and gay groups forming in the church, going to the churches as a place of sanctuary to meet. And so the churches began a relationship in how they were dealing with affirming issues. In the Morally Ecumenical Conference, we have the Day of Prayer adopted in GC 24 in 1971. And in 1984, the United Church affirms acceptance of all human beings as persons made in the image of God. 1986, you have the first apology. 1988 is the year of GC 32, where all people, regardless of sexual orientation, are welcome as full members, and also in the clergy as well. In 1992, you had the Human Rights Act that urges sexual orientation inclusion, which was amended in 1996, included by the church's advocacy for human rights and the rights of LGBTQ people. And so, been a great deal of success that's been happening. In 1995, we have Affirm United formed. In 1998, the second United Church apology specifically for residential schools made by, put forward by our own former moderator, Reverend Bill Phipps. 2000, the United Church of Canada anti-racism policy was adopted. An affirming congregations program was endorsed. In 2006, the Intercultural Church had a commitment put forward in the United Church that we would work toward becoming an intercultural church. 2008, Government of Canada issued their apology. The residential school settlement was signed. In 2009, there was a commitment to inclusion in the United Church. And in 2012, an intercultural vision was adopted. 2015, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was completed, the recommendations were put forward, the 94 calls to action, those were adopted in 2015. The following year, 2016, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted wholesale. They didn't do what Canada is doing, which is to take it apart and find the parts that they want to apply and how they want to do it and rewrite the document. That's what Canada has been battling with a lot of the communities about. But for the United Church, we just accepted the document as it is. And so showing that leadership role again. 2017, the calls to the church were approved and the Government of Canada apologized to LGBTQIAA plus 2S people. In 2019, you had the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls and Two-Spirit report released. There was a call to get a strategic action plan together, and that had been delayed in the past couple of years. So now to this year, they're kind of doing it, but without a lot of input from key Indigenous organizations. And I think that they're glossing over with some of it came out very quickly on the second anniversary in 2021. And so we haven't seen a lot of effort to be inclusive in that process. So the federal day school settlement was reached in 2019. And so you have people still continuing to put forward their claims. The National Consultation for Affirming Ministries was working, and a Canadian coalition of affirming ministries with 15 different faith communities and faith-based groups. And in 2020, in October, the Anti-Racist Denomination Declaration and Commitment was made. Today, there are 230 affirming churches in the United Church and 170 in process. And in the on the Indigenous side, the 60 Scoops claimants are currently putting their filings in for those that were adopted out to white families and abused by that system. So there's movement, and that's the reason why I put this timeline together, is to acknowledge that there are things that have been done, and it's important to know where we are historically, especially in this time when things are moving very quickly. And so there's effort happening, and we don't really hear or recognize that a lot of times, but it's important that we remember that there's always an opportunity to learn more and to participate on some of these issues that are ongoing and newly addressed. I think in the last, if you look at this timeline, 2015, 16, 17, there's increased activity happening and there's increased awareness. And I think that is triggered also in 2019 by the Black Lives Matter movement and by the Idle No More movement, and things that people are standing up for, and ways of building coalition and trying to work toward a more satisfactory result for our communities. And so it's an ongoing effort, and I think the church is an important part of that. I'm gonna stop this right now. I know you're information overload for some, and maybe get some feedback and questions if you have any. So I'll turn it back to Keith.
Yeah, please, if you have any questions, you can either use the share hand or raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. There's a reactions button. You can click that and click raise hand, or just type into the chat if you're uncomfortable being on camera. I see John has a question.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for this.
Yep.
An earlier slide, you mentioned that the goal was to return to balance again,
Mm-hmm.
to the way things used to be. When was that?
So in the 1960s, Bob Thomas, his focus was around trying to restore the sovereignty of the people that had been sort of fractured from their beginnings. And I have a short video actually that would be interesting for people to watch. I didn't want to add it in, but I think that might kind of show what was going on and the reason for that response that he gave. I'll play a bit of it.
Okay.
Fun to see. This is a short clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing.
Alberta, Canada. On the Stoney Indian Reserve, the teepees stand in the meadows as in the old days of the summer hunts.
That's really nice, isn't it?
Here's that energetic voice got again.
After 2 days and nights of driving, Susan and the Chicago group take their first step back in time. Far from city pavements, they try to set up camp.
We don't know what the hell we're going to do with our tent. We don't even know how to set it up.
Hey, someone here, we gotta lower it first to get that thing hooked on it, right? Yeah, right. Oh, you gotta push it up more.
And you got to put it where the stake is, where the corner stake is.
Push it there. It's almost right. Wait a minute, no, you got the wrong one, Terry. Oh, my. Oh. Oh, wait, pull it back this way.
No. That's your twist.
It is a great encampment. From every part of North America, 2,000 Indians from 50 tribes have come to the Indian Ecumenical Conference to share their unique inheritance and renew a common hope. Some, like Susan, search for a revelation, a new inner certainty. The elders recognize the need.
I hope that they're finding something of themselves wherever they come from across the land. We desperately need this now, that we're reaching that point, I think, in life on this planet, perhaps, but it's certainly in terms of Native people in North America, that there is that tremendous need to survive in here.
Over there. Right there, good enough.
People just come and they're allowed to do whatever they want to do, meet with old people mainly, go to sweat lodges, and try to find out more about the particular way of life we used to live in this country.
Most learning will come through doing. Terry, a Yankton Sioux from the Chicago group, finds out how to raise a teepee.
Open over, pull this up and let him push that in. Okay, can you push that in? One more tip up, go home. Between the two. Between the two. Look at the dog. Okay, now she's in. Okay, just take that right around. I learned
After he puts in those sticks there, you put stakes in the bottom.
Yeah, we got them sticks to hold weak one.
You bridle them, you ride them. Have I got a deal for you? Here, have a bridle.
Since Southwest tribesmen first rode Spanish horses over 3 centuries ago, Indians have been masterly riders.
Come on. Come on. Don't take it out on me because you're bigger than me.
Oh, look at that, folks. I look like George Custer himself.
But the Chicago group needs practice.
Smile. Good. Hold it, hold it.
Whoa, whoa. Is this saddle on tight enough?
Aside from Susan, few of the city-bred Indians have seen a horse outside a movie.
No.
Willingly, the group joins in the work that must be done, helps build the powwow circle, gathers branches for the speaker's arbor. There is no formal agenda, but for the next 7 days, this will be the center of the Intertribal Conference.
There we go. All right, gentlemen, you're now watching a circus act here. Now go up there. Up there. There. You got your slipper shoes on.
Here, the sacred fire will burn steadily day and night. Here, Susan and her companions may listen to the elders and may themselves be heard. Here, they will join in ceremonies and prayers which belong to them, but which they never knew.
And I'm just going to relate the pure experiences that hit me here the most in my heart.
I'm not condemning that religion that a white man was given to by God. That's his religion. It was given to him on another island. Us too, we was given a way to worship the Creator on this island. But we have lost parts of it. And it's up to us to find that again. And to relive it. And be Indian people again.
That's the trouble with our people. When they change and they believe with all their heart. And then it's hard to bring them back to the right road. But our young people realized that they weren't on the right road. And a few of our elders realized. So they are helping us come back to the right road.
I think that, in a way, explains all that was involved with that question. I think that the practice itself and the conference became a leadership center that helped the young people to relearn the cultural ways and to adapt what needed to be changed into the world that we know today. A lot of the people that came out of that ecumenical movement later became national leaders in the movement, especially around the repatriation of the Constitution. So they were integral in the rewriting of Section 35 and other parts of the Constitution. And so it's that type of leadership that we're hopeful can be tapped into again as we revive that practice and bring people again in this current generation back to those teachings and how important that is that we know who we are, not just in a pan-Indian or a generic kind of way, but know what our people believed and know what our history is, because each one of those is important. And that's why we have Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you, Tony. I think that may be about time for today. I know there's a few other questions here, but there will be many more opportunities to engage in this content. I'm going to post in the chat here some more links here. So 5 p.m. today, there's the Interfaith Prayer. 7 p.m. tomorrow, a screening of We're the Children that explores the history and legacy of residential schools. There'll be a conversation around that as well. And for more, join the Right Relations Circle to find out about more events. This Lunch and Learn series is just beginning. We are going to take a bit of a break for the summer, but we're going to come back in the fall to look at more topics like anti-racism, unconscious bias, LGBTQ2SIA+, what does it all mean? As well as looking at contemplative justice and more. So make sure to stay tuned for that. And if you want to support the program, you can always donate here. But please give a warm thank you and to Tony Snow for leading this session. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Keeping it right on the hour.
I love the idea of a conference with no agenda. We as white people could really learn to just gather and see.
It's interesting that church, that synagogue in Vancouver that we heard about in the VST, telling us that there's a synagogue there. They've not had a rabbi there in decades, and the people just kind of, they get up and they read the scripture, they do it sort of organically and practice their faith without the need of any type of head or leader. I thought that was really astounding and something that's been ongoing right in front of us.
Yeah, there's something in that. I suspect that the leadership we need in capitalist progress for the sake of perpetual progress, where we're all hemmed in by agendas and timelines and schedules, that to just gather and see what the collective spirit calls us to do. It'd be nice to see something like this happen again. So
thank you to everyone who came. Yeah, glad to see some coming out and wanting to learn more about this day and what we're celebrating. So really encouraging.
All right, wonderful. See you at some of the upcoming events. Take care, everyone.
See you.